Welcome, everybody, to episode 42 of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn. I'm here with my longtime colleague, Bill Roggio. Bill.
Hey, everyone. How are you?
We are senior fellows at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and we run FDD's Long War Journal. And, of course, the longest of the long wars that we cover is the one in Afghanistan, and we're going to return to that this week. Bill and I have some trepidation about talking about Afghanistan because there's so much to say, and yet we're kind of sick of saying it in some ways, right, Bill?
I am tired of it.
Yeah, I think we're tired of talking about it, of course, because we've made our positions known, but that doesn't mean that it's unimportant to keep, that we shouldn't keep talking about it, or it's unimportant. We have to keep commenting on this because there are current events, there's news. And the news this week, or in recent days, is in late January, the new National Security Advisor for President Biden, Jake Sullivan, he made some comments on basically the deal between the United States and the Taliban, which was signed last February 29th of 2020. And Sullivan outlined what he thought was in the agreement and sort of gave some comments on the way ahead, a way forward. And the three things that Sullivan, Bill, I'm going to use this as sort of framing for our podcast this week. So you can chime in. I'll get the three out, and then you can talk about it. You can go to town. So the three things that Jake talked about, that Mr. Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, talked about were, first, that there has to be sort of a real bona fide and sustainable way that the Taliban will cut ties with terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda. That's the first thing. I'm paraphrasing what he said, but there's some quotes in there. The second thing that Sullivan laid out is that the Taliban have to meaningfully reduce levels of violence and contribute toward ceasefires. That's the second thing he said. And the third thing, he said they have to participate, this being the Taliban, in a real way, not a fake way, in negotiations with the Afghan government. So here's a quote from Sullivan. He says, "So what we're doing right now is taking a hard look at the extent to which the Taliban are, in fact, complying with those three conditions, and in the context, we will make decisions about our force posture and our diplomatic strategy going forward." Now, he says that these are three components of the agreement, according to Sullivan. Now, look, this is a new administration. They're just coming in, getting briefed up on this and going to work on these issues. So he probably hasn't had time to go through the rather terse agreement, which we're going to talk about. And he probably hasn't had time.
Can I interrupt really
quick? Of course.
I know we say this all the time, but if you didn't have time to go over a 3 1/3-page agreement before taking the job as National Security Advisor.
I know.
Because everyone knows that Afghanistan was going to be one of the top immediate issues given the timeline. I'm trying to be charitable
here because, the guy's got a lot on his plate to come in a new administration. There's a lot going on. So
I do hear that, but they won the election in early November.
But point taken. I mean, it's one of the things we've talked about, and one of my running jokes is that when you go to rent a car, you sign a much more comprehensive agreement than the thing that was signed in Doha last year. If you go to buy a kitchen appliances from Home Depot or something, you're going to get probably more extensive paperwork than this. So this paperwork was not exactly elaborate, right? It doesn't take a lot to actually wade through it. It's kind of, and yet you and I have talked about the fact that a lot of people commenting or writing about this haven't actually read the agreement.
Yeah,
a lot of journalists we talked to haven't read it. I mean,
I can't tell you every time I speak to a journalist, Tom, I say, "So have you read the agreement?" I was like, "All you need is 5 minutes," and no, because they're always repeating the talking points from Zalmay Khalilzad and General Miller. That the Taliban have agreed to cut ties to Al-Qaeda, not in the agreement. The Taliban have agreed to reduce violence, not in the agreement. The Taliban have agreed to negotiate with the Afghan government, again, not in the agreement. So I send it to them and they go, "Oh." So, yeah, I mean, it's not a heavy lift to read that agreement. And then people fall back on, well, there's a secret agreement. All right. Well, then, if those things were so obvious, why are you talking about them in open? Why did it need to be secret if you can talk about them in the open? None of this makes sense. And we all know because they're flacking for a bad agreement.
Let's take the three things that Sullivan outlined, because the one that's the most unambiguous, I would say, is the second one, where he says that the Taliban agreed to meaningfully reduce levels of violence and contribute towards ceasefires. Now, the English text of the agreement and the text of the agreement was put out by the State Department last February. There's nothing about reducing violence in that agreement. Right. Not anything, right? There's nothing. I mean, you can keep, even if you don't want to read the 3 and a third pages or whatever it is, right? You just keyword search on reduce or violence, right? I mean, you can find it and there's nothing in there.
Yeah. Keyword search, reduction, reduce, or violence.
Whatever iteration of the word reduce you want,
Yeah, right.
Now,
it's not there, folks.
Right. Now, they would say, some people have intimated or implied that it's in these secret annexes or something like that. Maybe there is something in those annexes. I don't know.
But Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but that was reviewed by members of Congress. And they said
no, it's not in there. Yeah, that's not in there. Right.
So, nor the break ties with Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Well, the Afghan thing's a little more ambiguous. We're going to get into that. But
absolutely.
Let's do the reduction of violence. As far as we could tell, there's nothing in there about a reduction in violence that we can see. And this is why I was trying to be a little charitable with Sullivan. I think he's repeating the points that he heard from the military, like you said, and other officials in Washington, as opposed to really critically examining this actual agreement that was signed, So when we go through it, there's nothing about reduction of violence. Now, Bill, what's happened since February 29th, 2020? Has there been a hint of a reduction of violence in Afghanistan whatsoever by the Taliban?
No, and I've seen various numbers, but the violence has gone up significantly. I've seen 60%. I've seen it's doubled. I've seen 70%. I've seen and imagine it's based on different periods of time. So you've had more Taliban attacks because they're focusing their efforts against the Afghan military. They're looking to try to take control of territory. And by the way, that's getting far more difficult to track because the Afghan media is having a far more difficult time to do its job. And then we've had this concerted campaign of Taliban assassinations against civil society, lawyers. They killed 2 female judges in Kabul, politicians. They're going after journalists, members of NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. So the Taliban just saw this. Look, in one of their statements they issued today, the Taliban call it a termination of occupation agreement. So the agreement they signed with the U.S. had nothing to do with the Taliban, nothing to do with negotiations, reducing violence, cutting ties to Al-Qaeda. It had nothing to do with any of those things. To the Taliban, this ends the U.S. occupation. And so what's the next step when the U.S. occupation ends? The Taliban is going to seek to take control. And they've said this in numerous statements. So this entire reduction in violence, and I can't tell you, I seethe every time I hear a government official, Trump administration officials, DOD officials, Khalilzad, State Department officials constantly say the Taliban have to agree, live up to their agreement to reduce violence. Well, there is no agreement to reduce violence. Apparently, there's some backroom verbal agreements, is what General Miller claims. Sorry, if it's not in the deal, it's not official. And the Taliban are very clear, and the reason the Taliban likes this deal is because it could point to it. And again, only 3 1/3 pages. I used to say a half page, and then I looked at this real close, and I'm like, it's closer to a quarter. And then let me be kind and call it a third. And the other thing about this agreement is that line in there, Tom, that says the U.S. government, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by the U.S. I think it's repeated like 11 times in there. So I would say about a half a page of this document is just the U.S. denying that the Taliban is actually the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So if you block that out, you probably only got 2 3/4 of a page to read on this.
Yeah, it's actually just the U.S. government saying, hey, we know you have insisted on calling yourself the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. We just can't, in this text, go along with that, but we can't talk you off of it either, So, basically, yeah, I mean. So there's nothing about reducing violence in the actual agreement that was released to the public. There are reports based on people who have seen the quote-unquote secret annexes that there's nothing in those either along those lines. But the bottom line is, so these 3 criteria you're going to look at to evaluate the deal, we just evaluated the second one. Okay, done. There was no agreement to reduce violence that we can see, and there has been no reduction of violence. So that's number 1 out of the way. Number 2, let's do the sit down to meet with the. Well, actually, before we move on, let me just say something about the reduction of violence. If there actually was a paragraph or some sort of clause that stipulated there was going to be a reduction of violence, you'd have to have metrics to figure out what that is, right? Because it's not a ceasefire, right? Reduction of violence is a weasel way of saying we couldn't get a ceasefire, so we're going to say there's going to be a reduction of violence, even though there really isn't one. But what does that even mean? Like, you're going to dispatch 2 suicide bombers that week instead of 3? Or I think that was your joke I just stole.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's okay. I appreciate that it has longevity.
Yeah. So, I mean, but that's, what does that even mean? And so none of that's, as a New Yorker, who is sort of jaded about business transactions and dealing with people and how you deal with the stuff. And as somebody who used to be an economist who reviewed contracts, that's me. I used to do that as part of my long time ago in this professional life. Words matter, contracts matter. And when you don't see anything in a contract that has anything to do with what's being claimed as in the contract, that's where you start to get suspicious. And that's the...
Yeah. I think if you were going to have a agreement for reduction in violence, it'd be more than 2 1/3 pages. 3 1/3 pages. That's just me. I mean, maybe you could devote a page to that, but I suspect it'd be a lot more detailed. Like you said, Tom, we'll just try to take over half the districts that we were going to try to take over. We'll kill 10 Afghan security personnel a day instead of 20. It's an absurd claim by U.S. officials. They've hung on to this. They need to be held account to this because it's not in the agreement. I do hope the Biden administration, comes to realize what this actual agreement is and casts it aside, because whether you want to get out of Afghanistan, stay in Afghanistan, whatever it is, this agreement must be discarded because it's garbage.
So yeah, you got to the conclusion there. That's good.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. It's okay.
Spoiler alert.
No, we've already told people that, right? So we've said that many times, unfortunately. So all right, let's skip to the third one before we come back to the Al Qaeda thing. So the third one is that the Taliban would participate in a real way, not a fake way, in negotiations with the Afghan government. Well, again, that's one of those things where it doesn't. I mean, there's a mention of talks in the agreement between intra-Afghan talks, something that the Taliban talks about that they're willing to do. But they never have recognized the legitimacy of the Afghan government or said anything in the agreement about, having a legitimate sit down with the Afghan government. Basically there's nothing that says that they have to have real talks with the Afghan government. And I don't know how you'd measure that anyway, because they could put on a whole theater, a whole spectacle in Doha. They have at times done that. And of course, nobody believes that they're real talks, which is part of what Sullivan is, I think, correctly getting at here, is that, nothing that's happened so far appears to be real talks. But again, how do you measure that? The difference between fake and real talks, that they're putting on fake talks because the Trump administration, this deal, basically just wanted to check that box. They just wanted the appearance of some sort of talks, and then they could say, we accomplished that. And so again, that's sort of, there's nothing in the deal that says that they have to sit down for meaningful talks with the Afghan government.
Yeah, people have taken the term there's nothing in there that mentions the Taliban must negotiate with the Afghan government. And again, as you said, Tom, Taliban refuses to recognize the legitimacy of the Afghan government. So what intra-Afghan talks is that the Afghan government is one party of many. So so basically the Taliban's position is we're one side, and then the intra-Afghan side, of which the Afghan government is just one part, is the other. So the Taliban's negotiating position is strong. The Afghan government negotiating position is one part of many, very weak. So again, that agreement says nothing. And okay, so you want to look at what it could be a metric of negotiations. Let's just say, well, I would say come to agreement on a ceasefire, right? That could be, we want negotiations that result. Taliban have said time and time again, we will not do a ceasefire. We don't recognize the Afghan government. So again, all the Taliban has to do here is conduct negotiations. It doesn't have to have, these negotiations don't have to result in anything. The Taliban have to just sit. And Tom, you and I have said from the very beginning, the Taliban were going to use these negotiations just as appearances. It would be the appearance of negotiation. They're going to run the clock out. The Taliban can legitimately say, hey, we're sitting down, we're talking. But this is today, February 1st, right? We're almost 1 year. There's not, I used to joke that the Taliban and the Afghan government agreed to the size and composition of the table. But I don't even think they've done that. They've agreed to talk about the size and the composition of the table. They haven't come to anything. There's been nothing in these talks that have resulted in any meaningful. It's show talks, and the Taliban are running out the clock using this. We predicted that they would do this. They're doing this currently. I'm very confident in saying that these talks will go nowhere if they continue. It's just the Taliban, flaunting the fact that it has a political office in Afghanistan, that it's being recognized internationally.
Doha, yeah, it has a political office in Doha.
I'm sorry, yeah, in Doha, yep. And that, look, its delegation just traveled to Russia over the past week. I mean, that's the legitimacy that the Taliban craves. And they're going to go nowhere. It's just a big sham.
Yeah, when you said that you joked that they had agreed on the size of the table, now you're saying they just agreed to talk about the size of the table. I kind of came to mind, you remember in the movie Office Space, where they have the marker board and the two Bobs or consultants have planning to plan on it, and they have a bunch of boxes that are all sort of, interconnected. And when you said that, that's kind of flashed in my head, was that planning to plan thing. That's basically what this was, right? We're going to talk about having talks without having any real talks, sort of planning to plan, talking to talk.
Bobs know how to keep their job, right? They just keep it running, run out the clock on this.
Which basically, brings up a great question for close on. If you've listened to this podcast and you've seen our congressional testimony, you see our writings, and you listen to us previously or on the radio or wherever else we talked about this stuff, we've been very critical of Zalmay Khalilzad, his game here. I would actually say that this is a good place where that one line from Office Space applies to him, which is, what would you say that you do here? Because he's been talking for a long time and didn't get anything accomplished really, other than trying to sell us this idea that the Taliban were going to be good actors now, or counterterrorism partners with respect to Al-Qaeda, but we're going to get to that.
So Tom, you're the generous one today, and I'm the not so generous one. I know the answer to that question. The answer to that is he's flacking for the Taliban. That's what Khalilzad is doing here. He has been from the beginning. He knows that. I know we're going to get into the Taliban Al-Qaeda ties. When I testified alongside him, he said that those ties run deep and were intractable. He knows all of that, and yet he's granted the Taliban the legitimacy they've craved for the past 2 decades. That's been his job. It's disgraceful.
So, two other things before we move on from the talks with the Afghan government. One, we mentioned the Islamic Emirate language in the agreement. That's important for a couple of reasons. One, the Obama administration, of course, walked away from talks with the Taliban circa 2013 because, in part, the Taliban wouldn't get off of the Islamic Emirate language. They wouldn't stop referring themselves as Islamic Emirate. Why is that important? Because that means the Taliban still is trying to resurrect its political authoritarian regime in Afghanistan. That's not really a hopeful sign that you're going to have peace in Afghanistan, or that they're going to reconcile with the Afghan government, and they're going to have meaningful peace talks with the Afghan government and sort of come together in a unity government of some sort. If they're still referring to themselves as Islamic Emirate, we've documented over and over again, there's no evidence that they've given up on their central political goal for this war, which is resurrecting the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. That's why that language is important. The agreement, it showed that the U.S. was going to enter an agreement with the Taliban, regardless of the Taliban's repeated stated political goals, which run contrary to the idea of peace to begin with. So the second thing about that is that we mentioned the legitimacy. Yeah, that's what they did. They used the talks in Doha to legitimize themselves. They had the first cabinet official in the history of the United States goes to meet with them. In terms of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, they open up new diplomatic channels to bolster their new Islamic Emirate, which they're hoping is going to return to power. So both in Russia and Iran and elsewhere, you had those meetings in Iran that you saw over the past couple of weeks.
Indonesia as well, Tom. They traveled to.
Yeah, so they're building up the international legitimacy for their Islamic Emirate. And in the middle of all that, you even had the previous president, Donald Trump. Now, look, you could say he was right to be critical of the Afghan war, fine. But he wasn't right to want to have the Taliban come visit him at Camp David or vouch for the Taliban as our counterterrorism partner, which we're going to get to that last piece here in a second. But that's what he did, and that's what his representatives did. So, that's very different from saying, hey, I want to have Afghanistan, to, hey, I want to bring the Taliban to Camp David, even as they're releasing videos that sort of, memorialize 9/11 and blame us for that attack, which is what they did in 2019. So, this is all a mess. It's all a giant mess. Of course it is. The politicians and the politicos don't really know what they're talking about. That's basically a theme for our coverage over the last decade plus now in Afghanistan, unfortunately. And we laugh and we have jokes about it, but this is all dark subject matter. We're laughing because it's just pathetic at this point. And it's sad because there are real lives on the line, there are real Afghan lives on the line. And I think before we move on to the Al-Qaeda part, what I would say to Afghans is, the Afghans are listening to this, you can't bank on any of this nonsense, right? I mean, this is all, if your lives are now on the line in fighting this, if you want to preserve some sort of Afghan government that is independent of the Taliban and fight on, you can't bank on any of this. You can't pretend that there's pieces at hand. It is not. And the Taliban has used all this to bolster its own position at your expense. I think that some people in the Afghan government know that. Now, the Afghan government has all sorts of problems too, of course, and I'm not, vouching for or absolving of the Afghan government of all of its problems. It has many, and that's part of why the war has gone this way. But if you look at all this, you see Afghan officials talk about the peace process. I think it's sort of absurd to talk about the peace process with the Taliban sending suicide bombers at Afghan security forces and, launching raids and trying to take more territory.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, and on that point, the Afghan government, yes. I mean, and people like to use this point to I don't flack for the Taliban, but look, one problem is a problem of corruption and problem of failure to come together and fight the Taliban meaningfully. And the other is a jihadist group that wants to subjugate people, put them on our horrible form of Sharia law. And we know what that looks like. It was called the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan circa 1996 to 2001, where women were, buried to their head and beheaded in parks and whipped and beaten for being doctors or for adultery, and that stuff is still happening to these days in Taliban-controlled areas. So, you could pick your side on that one. The other thing, Tom, I hope you don't mind me mentioning.
By the way, when you say pick that side, I mean, the bottom line is for all the problems that Ashraf Ghani faces and has with his government, do you want Ashraf Ghani running Afghanistan? Do you want Habatul Akhundzada? Right.
Yeah. Right. Do you want a chance to maybe work through corruption?
Or, by the way, it doesn't have to be Ghani, Abdullah, or even Karzai. Like, who do you want running Afghanistan? Or do you want Akhundzada? Right. And what basically the Taliban apologists are saying is they want Akhundzada.
Right. It really is. And your choice is either distasteful and discomfort or, frankly, evil. And I pretty much know what side I come down on that one. And, Tom, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this. We have, you mentioned the dark humor that we've developed over time. There's two things come to mind, and one of these you and I joke about. I call Afghanistan the world's worst soap opera, and as a play on As the World Turns, I call it As Afghanistan Burns. It's the 19th season. We're into the 20th season now, I believe, and each season is it just keeps getting worse and worse, and we just hope this season gets better. But frankly, we're just looking to move beyond these talks and see what the next chapter of As Afghanistan Burns. And the other thing is it's Groundhog Day. It's like every year you get a new bad policy on Afghanistan. Just things get worse. And, you just keep waking up, hitting that alarm clock and reliving, As Afghanistan Burns every day. Things just don't get better. And that's why we're tired. We're jaded. We don't want to talk about it. We're cynical, but we recognize that it's important. And, so I don't want to tout. I'm not one to toot our own horns here, but Tom and I have been right about this on Afghanistan, and that's part of our frustration. And people continue to push bad policy to keep telling us that the Taliban is going to break ties with Al Qaeda. The Taliban is going to destroy Al Qaeda, as Secretary Pompeo said. And we're just tired of hearing these things. We wish people would look at Afghanistan honestly, look at the facts, then develop meaningful policy instead of making the facts work the way, or manufacturing facts to drive the policy you want. So I'll end that rant there.
Yeah, and when I say tired, I'm tired of talking about it only because we've said our piece basically. I don't have any skin in the game, other people do, so I always make that point very clear. There are plenty of lives on the line. That's important. When I say I'm tired of it, what I mean is I'm just tired of having the same tired old debates, same tired old conversations, and there's not much of a market for, the truth of the matter is there's not much of a market for what we do, which is being critical on the one hand and honest about the Taliban and exposing sort of Al Qaeda's role in all this and Al Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan, which there are quite a few people who try and downplay and try and dismiss. And on the other hand, saying, look, the U.S. military doesn't have a game plan that's a winner here either, and being critical. I was looking back at some of our coverage. We were criticizing what the U.S. military was saying about Afghanistan more than a decade ago. Yeah, that's part of the reason why we're tired. Is how many times I got to say this? What they're saying is not accurate. Does not reflect the reality, and at some point, reality is going to catch up with all this. I sense, depending on what happens here in the coming months, that could happen this year. We'll see, even more so than in the past. But let's get to the final part.
Tom, one quick point. I mean, and part of our cynicism develops. Tom and I were very critical in 2008, 9, 10 of the Afghan surge, right?
Yeah, it was really 2010.
2010, yeah, when you started in 9. I mean, but yes, more U.S. soldiers died during that period. And Tom and I said, this isn't going to work And more soldiers died during that period and were killed and wounded during that period of the so-called surge than the rest of the war combined. And that's, and we were right. And I wish I was wrong. I mean, believe me, folks, I can't tell you how many times I just wish I was wrong on these issues. Because if I was wrong on that issue, there wouldn't be, I believe 2,000 soldiers were killed during that time period, if I recall. We're not just talking about, it's U.S. policy, we're going to stay in Afghanistan. People were killed and maimed and for life and wounded in ways and PTSD. And, this stuff matters at the end of the day. These are Americans, and there's thousands and tens of thousands of Afghans as well because of just horrible policy, refusal to recognize. That's of all these cynical things that happen, that surge really gets me the most. And because we knew the plug was going to be pulled on it, and we knew what the Taliban were going to do during that time period and after that time period. Sadly, we were right, and a lot of people have paid the price for that. Not for us being right, but for our political and military leadership for being feckless.
Yeah, and so the latest episode of being feckless really is this idea that the Taliban was going to break from Al-Qaeda. Now, the agreement, the only specific mention of Al-Qaeda is that the Taliban will prevent Al-Qaeda basically from using Afghan soil from plotting against America and its allies. Then there are some provisions after that which are read as basically applying the Al-Qaeda, that basically the Taliban won't allow anti-American terrorist groups or others to operate on Afghan soil, fundraise, train, that sort of thing. Although those passages don't specifically say Al-Qaeda, you can read the agreement as applying to Al-Qaeda. But here's the bottom line. The Taliban, in some of the press coverage before the agreement was signed last February, we heard that the Taliban was going to renounce Al-Qaeda. That didn't happen. There's been no renunciation. There's nothing in the agreement that says they're going to specifically renounce Al-Qaeda in some sort of public statement. There's language saying that they're going to say that, basically terrorists don't have a home in Afghanistan. That is included in the agreement. But the Taliban hasn't said anything along those lines either. Hasn't come out and said that if you're threatening America or anybody else around the world, you don't have a home in Afghanistan. There's been nothing that really qualifies that.
In fact, Tom, the Taliban says that Al-Qaeda isn't there. They left.
Well,
in
2001. Let's get to that for a second. So they haven't actually done anything to eject Al-Qaeda.
And after Secretary Pompeo said that the Taliban would actively destroy Al-Qaeda, that they agreed to that.
Right,
Not that there's any agreement. That was some backroom offhand comment by some Taliban lackey who just said things.
Yeah, Pompeo actually said they would work alongside us, meaning America, to hunt down and destroy Al-Qaeda. So
how could they do that if Al-Qaeda doesn't exist in Afghanistan?
Yeah,
this is our counterterrorism partner, folks.
Yeah.
The people that deny Al-Qaeda's presence while the U.S. and Afghan military are killing senior Al-Qaeda leaders.
Yep. So then the U.S. goes on to continues after this agreement was signed, and before the agreement was signed and after the agreement was signed, conducting raids against senior Al-Qaeda personnel. Afghan forces are going after Al-Qaeda personnel. You have official commentary from the Treasury Department, which we wrote up in the Long War Journal, the United Nations, and others. You have Al-Qaeda actually releases through one of these Al-Qaeda affiliated media groups its summary of operations in Afghanistan, which is called Khorasan. And they're trumpeting their ongoing operations in Afghanistan. The Taliban is still playing the theater and pretending like Al-Qaeda isn't there. But the bottom line is that you have no evidence that the Taliban has taken any action against Al-Qaeda. Right? So that's number one. Let's break this down to the layers here for evaluating the parts of this agreement. There's no evidence that the Taliban has done anything against Al-Qaeda. Nothing. Two, there is evidence that Al-Qaeda is still there. Significant evidence that Al-Qaeda is still there because you have these raids from the U.S. and the Afghans, and you have what Al-Qaeda itself is saying through affiliated media groups, where we have the statistics that they put out for 2020, their year-end operations in the Khorasan, that sort of thing, and they're sort of intimating that they are in fact still there and showing that they're conducting operations, although they do that on the sly. We'll talk about that some other time again. And then three, so you have, no evidence of the Taliban taking any actions against Al-Qaeda. Evidence Al-Qaeda is still there, of course. And then three, the Taliban just denies that Al-Qaeda is there at all. So they just say, nope, nothing to see here, folks. Al-Qaeda is not here and hasn't been here. Yeah. So,
Tom, can I add something to number two?
Sure.
So not only is Al-Qaeda operating in Afghanistan, but they're operating under the protection of the Taliban, because these senior Al-Qaeda leaders that have been killed over the last year and a half were killed in areas controlled by the Taliban and killed alongside Taliban leaders. So I just wanted to add, it's not just that Al-Qaeda's there and the Taliban's could say, well, they weren't in areas we control, or they weren't working with us. I don't know how they got there. Just it adds another layer to this that shows what a farce all of this is.
Definitely. So So now, if you want to evaluate the agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban, the report said this was going to take the Biden administration a few weeks, several weeks, not months, but weeks. We just did it in less than 30 minutes. We just walked you through it. That's it, folks. That's the evaluation of the agreement from February 29th, 2020. You can go into more details of the agreement. We're going to go on to that, here in a second. There's a couple other things to say about it, but it doesn't take very long to evaluate. There's not much to it, obviously they're trying to figure out what their policy is going to be, and they're going to use this evaluation of the agreement to sort of provide a window of opportunity to evaluate things and figure out what they want to do. But in terms of this agreement, in terms of its meaning and what it's done, it's accomplished nothing. We're here almost a year afterwards. It hasn't brought peace to the Afghan people. It hasn't led to the ejection of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban turning on Al-Qaeda at this point. There's no evidence for that. We'll gladly report it if and when that ever happens. Hasn't happened. Even though we said beforehand it wasn't going to happen, and it hasn't.
Yeah, Tom. We're 11 months in. There's been exactly 0 Taliban raids or killed or captured Al-Qaeda members. But I mean, we could point to numerous Afghan and U.S. raids where we've killed or captured senior, mid-level, and low-level Al-Qaeda operatives inside Afghanistan. So, just saying.
Now, there's a couple other things about the agreement. One in particular that stands out to me that the Biden administration should know, which is that there is that language saying, first of all, we know that the agreement says that the U.S. is going to withdraw by May 2021. They're well aware of that. The Taliban hasn't done anything in return for that, obviously, because we just outlined everything that's happened. And the Trump administration started withdrawing forces essentially for nothing. There was no give back for the Taliban, which gets back to our original point about all this, which was that if the U.S. is going to withdraw from Afghanistan, why go through this whole theater and this whole spectacle and whitewash the Taliban and pretend it's something it isn't, when if you're just going to withdraw anyway and they're not going to do anything to earn that, then just withdraw. You don't need to pretend the Taliban is our actor. The only part of all of this that actually matters for America is to get the Taliban to stand down in its operations against Americans as America's withdrawing. That's all that really mattered. You didn't need to do all of this to pretend that was the case. And there is some evidence the Taliban did attack American bases, by the way. There are some reports, even though that supposedly is in these secret annexes, that they're not going to attack the U.S. while the U.S. is heading out. But for the most part, that part of the agreement has held. They haven't killed any Americans since February 29th of 2020. That's great news, obviously, if you're jaded about all this and you don't want America to be there anymore. But you don't have to go through all the rest of this to get that. You don't have to pretend the Taliban is a legitimate counterterrorism partner for the United States of America at this point to get them to stand down. There's all sorts of ways you could have done that. The other thing is that, again, operating in that framework where even if all the Biden administration wants to do is just get out at this point and wants to remove the remaining 2,500 troops from Afghanistan, there is a clause in the agreement. I think it's Section 1F. I'll have to check this, and hopefully I didn't misstate that, but I think that's what it is. That says something to the effect that basically the U.S. will not use or threaten military force against Afghanistan ever again.
Yeah, Tom, I'll read it to you. I have it in front. It's the
is it 1F? Is it 1F?
It is. You have a fantastic memory. I'm a big fan. It says the United States and its allies will refrain from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Afghanistan or intervening in its domestic affairs. So the U.S. agreed, basically, we leave, as Tom said, we leave, and we never come back. We never interfere in Afghanistan's affairs ever again.
Well, isn't that a little chestnut in there, huh? Again, this is why people should have read this thing instead of just reporting on or reporting what other people are saying. Why don't you read the damn agreement instead of just repeating what Khalilzad or somebody in his office told you about it, or one of the Taliban apologists that's involved in all this has to say about it? So here's the bottom line. What that means is that if you're interested, if you still think that America needs to protect itself from terrorists, okay? Not making a big claim here, not saying that we need to do some big military action, not saying we need a nation build, forget all that. I'm just saying if you think that maybe the U.S. at some point in time may have to protect itself or defend itself against terrorists emanating from Afghanistan, at the point, even if the American troops have totally left Afghanistan, this agreement works against you. This agreement says that America has given up the right basically to self-defense. Well, what sense does that make? What purpose does that make? Without any kind of verification or enforcement mechanisms to change Afghanistan or change the Taliban, or without any sign or evidence that the Taliban is actually going to change its stripes. So when Bill and I say the Biden administration should get out of this agreement, we've outlined the reasons why. No matter what the U.S. wants to do at this point, this agreement makes no sense. It doesn't actually help us do anything at this point. None of what American people were sold about this or this process has come to fruition. None of it will come to fruition at this point. There's no reasonable expectation that this is going to lead to anything else. And from the Biden administration's perspective, let's say that President Biden wants to leave 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. I don't know that he will. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not going to predict what he wants to do. But let's say he decides he wants to have 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. Well, the problem, and I'm going to let you lead this one, Bill, and explain this. The problem is that the Taliban then takes the gloves off, right, and comes out the remaining force, both American and NATO forces who are in Afghanistan, and is going to make the supposedly select counterterrorism mission, which is the second point I know you're going to hit on here, how you can't disentangle that from the insurgency. But the Taliban's going to make that awfully difficult, after May 1st. And so if you're going to keep American forces in Afghanistan post May 1st, you'd have to then pretend that you're going to somehow reopen the diplomacy or reopen the talks between America and the Taliban. I don't see that happening. But why don't you explain why you think that that's problematic, Bill? I know from the beginning you hit on this.
Yeah, and so the first issue, the second issue we mentioned, the disentangling the Taliban from Al-Qaeda, as we mentioned, you can't fight Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan without fighting the Taliban. The two are inextricably linked at this point. The operations are integrated. And look, even that Treasury Department report that you just wrote up, Tom, was fantastic. You were the one that first pointed this out, and then within a week, everyone starts writing about it. Well, we all know no one would have found that if you had not found that. And it's telling you the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the ties are deepening. Not that they needed to be any deeper, that the Taliban are sheltering Al-Qaeda. They're giving them safe haven. Al-Qaeda is helping the Taliban fundraise.
The Taliban, the Treasury Department report, just to put this in perspective for people, these are counterterrorism / intelligence officials at the Treasury Department who are reporting to the Defense Department on what they're seeing in terms of Taliban, Al-Qaeda financing, and ISIS financing. And their conclusion is that the Al-Qaeda is gaining strength under the Taliban's banner in Afghanistan. That's their conclusion. Not our conclusion. That's their conclusion, right?
It happened to be our conclusion for years,
sure.
Tom.
But they independently have come to this.
Yes.
And then we saw the report and we wrote it up. And now the Taliban, this is how the reporting on this is so bad. Because what you saw when this was reported, as you mentioned, Bill, what happened is some journalists then reported on the Treasury Department report and then just reported the Taliban's denial. Basically, the Taliban said these are just coming from warmongers who are trying to keep the war going. Right. Well, excuse me, Treasury Department analysts are not the warmongers. You are, first of all, Mr. Taliban. You're the ones who are dispatching suicide bombers and going after Afghan forces. Second of all, certainly we're not the warmongers because we're reporting what the Treasury Department said. But yet the media just sort of repeated this denial from the Taliban, which is completely, fictitious, erroneous, and is really, I think it's immoral to just take them at face value on that and then basically let them, chastise other people at face value. I mean, it's just ridiculous. At some point, somebody should say, well, wait a minute, can you actually point to any actions you've taken against Al-Qaeda, Mr. Taliban? No. Okay, well then you don't get a say in this. Your denials are not gonna carry any weight.
Yeah, and the Taliban's denial in that again was, well, Al-Qaeda's not even here, so how could this even be possible? So again, this is they're as you said, they're entangled. How are you going to conduct counterterrorism operations against just Al-Qaeda if you assume that 2,500 or less troops in Afghanistan are going to do the mission? Keep in mind that this Al-Qaeda-Taliban relationship has only grown over the last decade. And that was when, at certain times, U.S. had plus 100,000 troops, 20,000 troops, up until the Trump administration started withdrawing last year.
And by the way, let me just interject one quick point there, because you're right. So one of the things we said was that as long as America had significant forces in Afghanistan, you got to get this right. They never got it right. So right. We don't think they're going to get it right now. I don't think that they're going to understand what this relationship looks like. We outlined, for example, very specific criteria. If you're going to sell us on the idea that Taliban's going to break with Al-Qaeda or renounce Al-Qaeda, here's what that means. We spelled it out in an article for Politico in 2019. We spelled that out in our reporting and our analysis and on radio and media. We said, listen, a lot of people are talking about this. They have a very abstract notion in their head about what the Taliban Al-Qaeda relationship looks like. Let's get into some specifics, some concrete details, right? And this is what you're going to have to tell us happened, and I don't want to go through all that again, because you can go through previous episodes of the podcast to go through all that. But the bottom line is none of that's happened, none of it, and the thing is that people still talk about this as if it's like a legitimate issue,
Yeah, legitimate promise. The agreement, all it says is that, and I'm going to read it directly just because that's what I think it's important. The Taliban, which of course the Islamic Emirate, which is of course isn't recognized, blah blah blah, will take the following steps to prevent any group or individual, including Al Qaeda, from using the soil of Afghanistan to threaten the security of the United States and its allies. And then it just lists some meaningless things. Provide.
Well, they're not going to let them train. They're not going to fundraise.
Right.
That kind
but
of stuff.
they could stay there.
Yeah,
they just can't do things.
Well, the problem is that they didn't. None of this got granular, right? So
Right.
what they mean was, okay, so explain what they're going to do about Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent specifically.
Right.
Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent specifically is fighting for the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So you're going to do what? You're going to take out its leaders. You're going to take out its operatives. You're going to jail them. You're going to have something concrete you're going to do, as opposed to just saying, well, we're not going to let them fundraise or train. And the problem is that this weasel language, which is sort of generic, what it does is it allows them all sorts of outs. It allows them to say, well, no, they're not really here. Don't worry about it.
Or nothing, even if they are here and they're not doing anything against the West. We'll assure you of that. Except the Taliban made the same claim prior to 9/11. Folks, just go read the 9/11 Commission report on this.
And it's made the claim ever since.
Made the claim ever since. Yeah, exactly. So we couldn't trust them before 9/11, but we could trust them today because we want to.
Yeah, so that's one of the big problems with the agreement is the lack of specificity in terms of, now you have these generic language, you're not going to allow them to fundraise, train, yada, yada, yada. What happens when America catches them allowing Al Qaeda to do those things, which they have been doing those things? What's the enforcement mechanism? What's the verification mechanism for going through all that? None of that's
turn them over to the U.S.
Right. None of that's spelled out. No.
They'll just prevent them. They'll make effort. They'll stop them. What does that mean? Like, as you said, Tom, the lack of specificity in this, this is just weasel language so that the U.S. can get an agreement to get the hell out of Afghanistan. We're critical of the Taliban of a lot of things, but when they call it an agreement to terminate occupation, I agree with the Taliban. They're actually.
Well, I agree with them. It was withdrawal agreement. It's not really an occupation. I mean, 2,500 Americans and 2,500 American troops and some NATO forces aren't occupying Afghanistan. That's sort of, and they're not. I think that in terms of meaning, there's a withdrawal agreement that's going to end the agreement. Yeah, that's what it was all about. But the other point there was that they, that was the big lie that we exposed early on, was that this basically Khalil Azad and Pompeo and State Department officials wanted to sell everybody on this idea that what happens in Afghanistan stays in Afghanistan. And I guess the last thing I would say about this is, look, I don't think it's a given. Sometimes when you have these conversations, people sound like, well, if the Taliban takes over Afghanistan, you're going to get another 9/11. I don't think that's a given. I mean, America has all sorts of defenses, all sorts of ways of protecting itself. I do think that the global jihad will rise, if the Taliban does take over Afghanistan alongside Al Qaeda, that you're going to have an increase in the probability of various threat streams. I think that's the way I would look at it. I don't think it's a guarantee you're going to have another 9/11. No, because, one of the episodes we're going to do on this is I want to walk people through, 9/11 itself, Al Qaeda to a certain degree got lucky, right? I mean, there were a couple things that went their way that if it hadn't gone their way, they wouldn't have pulled that off, So it's not as simple as saying, look, if the Taliban wins, we're going to get another 9/11. By the same token, if the Taliban wins alongside Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, it does increase the jihadi threat. It does increase the global jihad. I think that's sort of something that will be a boon for the jihadi cause. It will give Al Qaeda then a victory message, which is a big deal. We saw what the victory message was for ISIS and how that galvanized tens of thousands of supporters. You get the same sort of dynamic, only this time coming from Al Qaeda. Maybe it's less than what ISIS did. Maybe it's different, whatever. I mean, I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but there's some similarities there, And the other thing is, you and I know that part of what people are not gaming into all this is Al Qaeda has its tentacles all throughout these Pakistani groups and throughout these jihadi groups in Pakistan, and they've got all sorts of stuff that they're in the pipeline. I mean, who knows how that plays out? I mean, that's bad news too. I think at that point you're gonna see an increase in activity there as well, certainly throughout the Indian subcontinent, but probably elsewhere is what I would say. So the bottom line is from all this is that there was no reason to pretend that what happens in Afghanistan stays in Afghanistan unless there was some significant evidence that the Taliban really was going to turn against Al Qaeda and Al Qaeda affiliated groups, the alphabet soup of groups that we've covered for years, Long War Journal, Pakistani groups, Afghan groups that are all entangled in this sort of axis of the Taliban Al Qaeda. And to date, more than 11 months later, we have no evidence that the Taliban has changed its stripes on any of this. And so why adhere to an agreement that is it basically didn't bring peace to the Afghans, and it didn't do anything to protect Americans or any of our allies anywhere. So what was the point of this?
Yeah, exactly, Tom. And one quick point, and I know I probably stated this, but I'll just be very specific about it. Again, if you think that 2,500 or less U.S. troops in Afghanistan are going to be able to effectively target Al Qaeda, again, we've had a very low visibility on Al Qaeda. We've been able to kill some senior leaders. I can guarantee you, for every senior Al Qaeda leader that have been killed, and there's been 3 senior ones that we killed in the last year and a half. There's several more that are definitely lurking out there in Afghanistan.
At least,
no doubt.
Yeah.
At least, yeah. I mean,
the UN reporting identifies a number of several Al Qaeda leaders at least who have been meeting with, the Taliban officials, including throughout the talks between the Taliban and the U.S. I guess that's the one last thing I'd bring up here is that in both the Treasury Department report that I wrote up and in the UN reporting, there's this mention of the Haqqanis standing up a new fighting force with Al Qaeda inside Afghanistan. The Haqqanis have a very predominant share of the Taliban coalition at this point, including Siraj is effectively the number 2. You have all sorts of Haqqani officials all throughout the Taliban hierarchy, shadow governors, and the like. This agreement solved none of that, and so when to bring us back to what the new National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, the Taliban would have to renounce ties to Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups. That speaks to the fundamental problem here. The Haqqani network, is a designated terrorist organization. It controls a significant portion of the Taliban's operations, and some of the key Taliban leaders are, in fact, Haqqanis. They are terrorists. Not only is the Taliban a terrorist organization, whether the whole thing is designated or not, a big part of it, a significant part of it, is a designated terrorist organization. That's what they do. That's what their business is particularly in Afghanistan. But the Haqqanis, as we know, have sat at the sort of hub of this nexus of all these jihadi groups, including especially Al Qaeda, and incubated Al Qaeda and done everything they could to harbor these international terrorists through the years. They're not going to change all that overnight. There's no evidence that they are. So when any American says that the Taliban has to renounce Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups, this speaks to the fundamental misunderstanding of all this. The Haqqani network is a terrorist organization, both by designation and otherwise. It's closely allied with Al Qaeda, and it sits right at the hub of all this.
Yeah, Siraj Haqqani is probably the most influential Taliban leader, I would say. And, definitely their warlord, responsible a lot for their military and political strategy, was key when the Taliban had a schism after Mullah Mansour was appointed, after it was disclosed that the Taliban hid Mullah Omar's death. Siraj Haqqani and his father, Joscelyn, who's now dead, played a key role in getting all the Taliban groups back into the fold, except for one, which is really marginalized at this point in time. Look, and you look at his designations. Here's what the FBI says about Siraj Haqqani. I'm quoting here, maintains close ties to the Taliban. Obviously, he is Taliban, and Al Qaeda. He's a specially designated global terrorist. How do you, if he maintains close ties to Al Qaeda to this day, which he does, as Tom stated, how do you square this circle? Siraj Haqqani would have to publicly come out and denounce Al Qaeda. And folks, anyone listening to this, especially those of you guys in the know, that's not going to happen. The Taliban can't even admit that Al Qaeda's there, let alone get Siraj Haqqani to publicly denounce Al Qaeda. That's what would have to happen for this to be meaningful. It ain't happening, folks. So you just put this one aside. Tom, are we going to mention the Department of Defense position on the Taliban and living up to its agreement here?
Go ahead. You can go for it if you want. I mean, you can cite the new returned spokesman. He was spokesman before, Spokesman Kirby came out and said that, that they basically are not living up to it, that they haven't renounced terrorism, they haven't renounced Al Qaeda,
Yeah, lo and behold, after almost 11 months of us telling you that the Taliban weren't living up to this agreement and it wasn't going to happen, you have a change of administration, and then the Department of Defense, I'm sorry if I'm being impolite here, but finally gets a clue and goes, oh, after all these months, we finally, we killed some senior Al Qaeda leaders sheltered with the Taliban, but no one would come out and say it. that the Taliban wasn't living up to its agreement. And remember, the Department of Defense killed a press release that I know they had written, because I spoke to individuals at U.S. Forces Afghanistan at the Department of Defense, who know that this press release was written up on, Tom, I'm drawing a blank on his name. Why am I?
Asim Umar.
Asim Umar. Yep.
September 2019, he was killed in a joint Afghan-American raid in Helmand province. Was it Helmand?
The DOD knew. Yeah, exactly. He had a courier, direct courier to Ayman al-Zawahiri.
He was killed alongside Taliban commanders. He was under the protection of a Taliban shadow governor. He was obviously, he's obviously a Taliban guy.
And the Department of Defense buries this press release because they want to pretend that the Taliban is going to live up to this agreement. And, and then all of a sudden, now that there's a change of administration and there's some questions about policy, the DOD finally goes, oh, maybe the Taliban isn't living up to its agreements. And this is, again, you want to understand why Tom and I are cynical about all of this. It's things like this that drive us crazy. We know it's happening. Look, kudos to the DOD to finally come out and say it. I would argue it's, I don't know, 8 months too late. If you wanted to be charitable and give the Taliban a couple of months to see if they're going to live up to this agreement, I can understand being silent. If you want to put up one of the senior Al-Qaeda leaders killed as being, maybe some, I always love this term, rogue Taliban commander who, was going off the rails and not supporting Taliban policy. That's BS, as we all know. But, at this point in time, look, the DOD should have come to this conclusion, I would say, about 6 months ago.
Well, what I would add to this before we wrap up here, what I would say is, if you're familiar with how businesses negotiate and how real negotiators do transact, come to terms on contracts and transact their business and, the haggling that goes back and forth. The thing is that when the U.S. and Afghan forces find Asim Umar in a Taliban compound in Helmand, that's the type of thing that if you are really doing hard-nosed negotiations, use against the Taliban. You say, look, we just found this guy in your turf. We want you to turn over other guys, right? We want you to turn over other AQIS guys, other Al-Qaeda subcontinent guys. We want you to turn over other Al-Qaeda leaders because we know, don't lie to us and tell us that they're not on your turf. We just found one, a big guy there. And of course, America found others since then as well. But that's the point, right? When I criticize negotiations or these types of diplomacy, I'm comparing it to what I know of the business world from previous life and from how real, hardball negotiators do business. This is the opposite of that, right? This was weak-kneed, servile diplomacy that didn't do anything. It didn't help America. It didn't help with Afghanistan. That's my criticism of it. It's not, America needs strong diplomacy going forward. Absolutely. The U.S. military should not and cannot solve all of America's problems. Absolutely not. And shouldn't be the first thing that we lean on in every given situation. Absolutely not. But this is a model of how not to do diplomacy, right? This is a model of how not to actually conduct America's business around the world. It should be studied as such. I hope that eventually when there's some clarity on all this, not that there ever will be, but hopefully if there is some clarity on this someday in academia or elsewhere, again, I shouldn't even bring up academia. Let's say elsewhere, that somebody will study this and say, here's how we shouldn't do diplomacy, right? This is a good example of how diplomacy should not be conducted, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Tom. I mean, Asim Umar was just one. There were two other senior Al-Qaeda leaders killed after, and the U.S. military was silent about these.
Yeah.
They may have confirmed, particularly was it Roof? I'm drawing a blank on names today. The guy we killed was Al-Qaeda's.
The U.S. did confirm Hassam Roof, who was a big-time Al-Qaeda figure.
They confirmed he was killed, but they never discussed it in the context of the Taliban deal. Right. Exactly. They never said, oh, and by the way, this is evidence that the Taliban. They just said, oh, yeah, we killed him.
Right.
But there was never any discussion. And as you said, Taliban wasn't held to account for sheltering senior Al-Qaeda leaders. As you said, this is no way to
and that's the point, right? Is that maybe something was said behind the scenes in Doha or elsewhere by the American side. Who knows? I mean, it's possible. But my point is that if you're actually really trying to get a strong agreement and strong negotiations, this is the type of thing that you use and you shove it right in their face and you say, look, this is strong evidence you're not living up to what you said you were going to do in the Doha agreement. And instead we get all this squirrely behavior, by the American side and all this, which is part of the reason why this is all, why we don't think that this is going to be turned around anytime soon and basically we don't already have any faith in the leadership on these issues.
Yeah. And not only does the DOD punt on that issue, the press punts on that issue as well. They never discuss the killing of Rauf or Simo Omar,
just offhanded mentions. I think there were a couple offhanded mentions in the press, but nothing that really, it didn't really, listen, this isn't, you can report on something by using basic logic, right? That's my point. You don't have to have a source that says, this obviously shows the Taliban isn't living up to their commitments. If he's killed in Taliban turf, which is what the sources said, and he's working with the Taliban, and he's a senior Al-Qaeda guy, 1 + 1 = 2. The Taliban hasn't turned on Al-Qaeda, right? It's pretty easy job. You don't need to do a lot of reporting on that to figure that out. But that's where we are. I think that's it for me. Listen.
Yeah, no, Tom, that's a perfect place.
The thing is, look, folks, we could go on and on and on about this. We've criticized this thing ad nauseum before in the past. We're just doing this now in the context of, what the new National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said in terms of the Biden administration evaluating the deal. I think it's pretty easy for them to evaluate the deal. The deal is not worth the paper it was printed on, even at 3 1/3 pages, as Bill emphasized. That paper is worth more than what the deal is worth. That's not the question. The question is, does President Biden want to risk the government in Kabul being basically toppled during his first year or two in office by pulling out all American troops, which leads to withdrawal of all NATO troops? Is that something he wants to put up with and deal with after the fact? I don't know. Maybe not. We'll find out what he wants to do. But I think that in terms of decision making, if I were in the Biden administration, what I would say is, look, folks, these guys, they could be a little cantankerous at Long War Journal, but they just evaluate the deal for you pretty quickly. There's no there. Figure out what you want to do in terms of what defends America's interests and what you actually want to sell politically to the American people, what you think would be politically acceptable, and base it on that. Don't base it on what's on this meaningless paper that came out of Delaware.
Couldn't agree more, Tom. Amen.
Well, thank you to our audience again this week for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts. We've got stuff we're working on. We got new stuff coming out this year. We got more guests. Tune in. Give us the 5-star review if you can on Apple Podcasts. We appreciate it. And we will see you again, hopefully, next week.